Hello and welcome to CHIME, a Recovery Model Explored webinar. I'm excited to present this webinar to you and give you an opportunity to consider the CHIME Recovery Framework and to prompt you with a few questions. I work for the Mental Illness Fellowship of WA, otherwise known as MIFWA, and we're proud to present this webinar. The outline of this webinar includes talking about recovery and encouraging you to think about your own definition of recovery. We're going to look at what is CHIME and make sense of CHIME and understand the framework. You're going to have a chance to really think about how the CHIME model can apply to you in your own life, or the people that are in your life. And then I'll ask you at the end about what sort of actions you might consider taking next. So first, let me ask you, what is recovery? I want you to pause this video and write down your own definition of what you think mental health recovery means for you. What do you think it is? So pause the video now and write down what you think recovery is. Now that you've defined recovery for yourself, I want you to look at your answer and consider whether in your answer it suggests that recovery is the same as a cure. Many people would say that recovery is not the same as a cure. I know in my own life, recovery has been a personal, long process. It hasn't been a linear process. I haven't just gone from being unwell to being well, or being not recovered to suddenly being recovered. There's been ups and downs, and I've had support along the way. Many people have reflected to me how recovery is a really individual process, that nobody can define recovery for somebody, but that they define it for themselves. And I remember when I was receiving mental health support from a service provider, that they asked me, my support worker asked me the question while we were developing a recovery action plan. They asked me, Hayley, what does recovery mean for you? Now, I had never been asked that question. I don't think I'd ever thought about it before, and I didn't know all that much about recovery. So I remember being quite shocked as I realized someone was asking me what I wanted for my life. And I didn't know the answer straight away, but with a little bit of time and support, I was able to answer what recovery meant for me. And that then planted seeds in my life about what steps I wanted to take, and how I wanted my life to look. It also taught me how valuable it was in defining it for myself. It wasn't like somebody else was telling me, okay, Hayley, you have to do these 5 things. And then once they're all ticked off, that means you're recovered. Because maybe that wasn't going to work for me. But by defining it for myself, I felt empowered, and it really gave me the strength to be able to follow through with the things I wanted to do. MIFWA believes that recovery from a mental illness is a deeply personal, individual, and dynamic process. Therefore, we do not prescribe to a particular set of outcomes, timeframes, or methods, but we encourage the individual we may be supporting to self-direct their progress. Pat Deegan has spoken about recovery. She has said, everyone's recovery is unique. Each of us must find our own way, and no one can do it for us. Pat Deegan has also said, recovery is a process, not an end point or a destination. Recovery is an attitude, a way of approaching the day and the challenges I face. I know I have certain limitations and things I can't do, but rather than letting these limitations be occasions for despair and give up, I have learnt that in knowing what I can't do, I also open up the possibilities of all I can do. And hopefully you did have a chance to define recovery for yourself, because it's important to remember that recovery is individual, that while we may do it with the community around us, it's our choice to define it for ourselves, and no one can do that for us. And I wouldn't want them to. We're now going to look at the CHIME model. The CHIME model um, is a conceptual framework that came about through um, through systematic research done by Mary Leamy and their team in 2011. It involves 5 recovery processes, and these are 5 things that we believe all people need in their lives, no matter who they are, how old they are, where they're from, and we call them the CHIME factors. So watch this clip with me and I'll explain more when we come back.
What is CHIME? Connectedness, hope and optimism, identity, meaning in life, empowerment. Connectedness means having peers, good relationships, support from others and being part of the community. Hope and optimism means believing recovery is possible, being motivated to change, having positive thinking and having aspirations. Identity, rebuilding a positive sense of yourself and dealing with stigma. Meaning in life can include making sense of mental illness, having a good life and rebuilding your life. Empowerment, being responsible for well-being, being in charge and focusing on your strengths.
So that's the CHIME recovery framework. Let's unpack it a little bit further. I'm going to read through this PowerPoint with you and also give you some examples, some real world examples of how CHIME framework could work in practice. So the first one was connectedness. This includes peer support and social groups, relationships, support from others, and a community. The next is hope and optimism. This involves belief in recovery, motivation to change, hope-inspiring relationships, positive thinking and valuing effort, and having dreams and aspirations. Then we have identity, rebuilding positive sense of identity and overcoming stigma. Meaning, this includes meaning in mental health experience, meaningful life and social roles, and meaningful life and social goals. And then finally, empowerment, personal responsibility, control over life, and focusing upon your strengths. Now, I didn't know about the CHIME framework when I was going through my own personal recovery initially. However, looking back at my journey, I realized that many of these things were at play as I was focusing on my recovery. I just didn't know it at the time. And so I want to give you a little bit of an example of how the CHIME framework could apply to various people in different ways. And I want to start by using an example that isn't related to mental health. So let's say I want to start working on my physical health. I tell a friend, I say, okay, I just want to work on my physical health. I don't know really where to start. I'm feeling a little bit unmotivated. And my friend says to me, oh, Hayley, you should do netball. I'm telling you right now, netball is the key. It has changed my life. I've been doing it for 6 months now, and I just think everybody should play netball. And I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And I could be thinking, netball is never going to work for me. I don't like team sports. I have a bad knee. I can't make the Tuesday night practice. Netball would never work. But I want you to think about maybe why that friend is saying that that works for them. Because I think that potentially there are 5 key things happening with that person and their experiences as they attend netball. So maybe they're feeling a sense of connectedness. They're a part of a team and they're able to connect with other people and build relationships. They're feeling hopeful and optimistic that maybe their team is going to reach the grand final and they're going to win. They have a sense of identity that is shifted. Maybe before they were only seen for their role as maybe a mother or as related to their career, but now all of a sudden they're a netballer as well. Maybe they've found a sense of meaning by being able to contribute to a team and offer something. And they're feeling empowered because, for once, they're doing something that they want to do and they're able to make choices about the things that matter to them. Maybe that's why that works for that friend, but maybe why it wouldn't work for me. And so CHIME is a framework. It's not saying you have to do all these things. It doesn't say that things have to go in order. What it's saying is that by looking at these 5 areas and trying to seek those out in our lives, that maybe it will contribute to good mental health and possibly a recovery journey. We're going to expand upon CHIME a little bit more, and you're welcome to pause at any time to read through the framework and think about how that might fit in your life or in the lives of people you know. But we're going to watch a clip by a speaker named Eleanor London now. Eleanor London gives a TED talk. This will go for about 6 to 7 minutes. And at about the midway point, I think at about 3:36 in terms of the video timing, there's a moment where Eleanor notes something that's quite distressing. And so I want to bring that to your attention. She speaks about it for maybe 3 to 5 seconds and then moves past the topic. But just keep that in mind. So let's watch this clip from Eleanor London, and then afterwards we'll consider how maybe CHIME has applied to Eleanor's life.
This is a story about a voice and a voice hearer. And it begins with me as an anxious teenager leaving home to go to university. Now, these were happy days at first. I'd done well at school, expectations for me were high, and I eagerly entered the student life of lectures, parties, and traffic-coned theft. Now, underneath this veneer, I was actually deeply unhappy and emotionally insular, but I was skilled at hiding it. And it was with considerable surprise when I was joined in my second term by a new presence, a disembodied voice which calmly narrated everything I did in the third person. She is reading, she is going to a lecture, she is leaving the room. It was neutral, banal, oddly companionate, although I did notice it sometimes mirrored my own unexpressed emotion. So, for example, if I was angry and had to hide it, which I often did, being very adept at concealing how I really felt, then the voice sounded frustrated, but otherwise it was neither sinister nor disturbing. Now, it was then that I made a fatal mistake in that I mentioned the voice to a friend, and she was horrified. Her implication was that I should immediately seek medical help, which I did, and which proved to be mistake number 2. Now, I spent some time telling the campus GP about what I perceived to be the real problem: anxiety, low self-worth, fears about the future, and was met with bored indifference until I mentioned the voice, upon which he dropped his pen, swung round, and began to question me with a show of real interest. And to be fair, I was desperate for interest and help, and I began to tell him about my strange commentator. And I always wish at this point the voice had said, "She is digging her own grave." I was referred to a psychiatrist who also took a grim view of the voice's presence, subsequently interpreting everything I said through a lens of latent insanity. So, for example, I was part of a student TV station that broadcast news bulletins around the campus. And during an appointment, which was running very late, I said, "I'm sorry, doctor, I've got to go. I'm reading the news at 6. Now, it's down in my medical records, Eleanor has delusions that she's a television news broadcaster." Now, it was at this point that events began to rapidly overtake me. A hospital admission followed, the first of many. A diagnosis of schizophrenia came next. And then, worst of all, a prolonged and toxic sense of hopelessness and despair about myself and my prospects that tormented me beyond endurance and drained me through humiliation, helplessness, and loss of self-respect into a shadow of myself. But having been encouraged to see the voice, not as an experience, but as a symptom, my fear and resistance towards it intensified. And this essentially represented taking an aggressive stance against my own mind, and in turn, the voices increased. One voice became 12 and grew progressively menacing and hostile, setting me bizarre tasks, ordering me to harm myself as I grew increasingly demoralized and disempowered. 2 years later, and I had the whole frenzied repertoire: terrifying voices, grotesque visions, bizarre, intractable delusions. My mental health status had been a catalyst for verbal abuse, discrimination, and physical and sexual assault. And I've been told by my psychiatrist, Eleanor, you would be better off with cancer because cancer is easier to cure than schizophrenia. I'd been labelled, I'd been medicated, and I'd been left. And by now, I was so tormented by my voices that I attempted to drill a hole in my head in order to get them out. Now, 6 minutes is not enough time to fully credit those good and generous people who fought with me and for me and who waited to welcome me back from that agonised, lonely place. But together, they forged a blend of courage, creativity, integrity, and an unshakable belief that my shattered self could become healed and whole. And crucially, they helped me to understand what I'd always suspected, that my voices were a meaningful response to painful life events, particularly childhood events, and as such were not my enemies, but a source of insight into solvable emotional problems. And so, ultimately, I gathered together my splintered self, each fragment represented by a different voice. And I went back to psychiatry, only this time from the other side. I returned to study and gained the highest degree in psychology that the university had ever given, and 1 year later, the highest master's, which I always say isn't bad for a nutter. In fact, during my stats exam, one of the voices actually dictated the answers, which technically possibly counts as cheating. Thank you. I worked in the NHS, I spoke at conferences, I published book chapters and academic papers, and I argued, and continue to do so, that an important question in psychiatry shouldn't be what's wrong with you, but rather what's happened to you. And all the while, I listened to my voices, with whom I'd finally learned to live with peace and respect, and which in turn represented a growing sense of compassion, acceptance, and respect towards myself. I'm now very proud to be part of the International Hearing Voices movement, an initiative inspired by the work of Professor Marius Rom and Dr. Sondra Escher, which locates voice hearing as a creative and ingenious survival strategy, a sane reaction to insane circumstances, not as an abstract symptom of illness to be endured, but as a complex, significant, and meaningful experience to be explored. As Peter Levine has said, the human animal is a unique being endowed with an instinctual capacity to heal and the intellectual spirit to harness this innate capacity. In this respect, I would like the TED audience to be aware of two things. Firstly, that as members of society, there is no greater honour than facilitating that process for someone. And for survivors of distress and adversity, that we remember what lies behind us and what lies ahead of us are small matters compared to what lies within us. As a very wonderful doctor once said to me, don't tell me what other people have told you about yourself. Tell me about you. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a think about some of the stuff that Eleanor just spoke about. So she touched on a number of things, and I think that presentation was incredibly powerful. It reminds us that mental health issues are not necessarily something to be fought, and the symptoms that we live with are not necessarily automatically a bad thing, especially when we look at things through that sort of a clinical or a medical model. It's easy to think poorly of our experiences. But I like that Eleanor said just that it's an experience. If we view it as an experience instead of just a symptom, it can be life-changing. And she was able to connect with her own identity and the role that her voices were playing in her own life. So what we're going to look at is thinking about the CHIME model and how Eleanor touched on those areas in her own life. Where did connectedness come up? Where did hope and optimism come up for her? What about identity or meaning or empowerment? Have a quick think, pause the video, and think about where the CHIME model came in for Eleanor, and then I'll talk you through it afterwards. Okay, so let's look at the CHIME model together. Connectedness. Now, there was a point where Eleanor didn't get a chance to go into this in too much detail, but she did say that there wasn't enough time to share how many people have been incredibly supportive in her recovery journey. But she did talk about being part of the Hearing Voices movement, which is a national movement that's full of peer support from others who are voice hearers. She talked about the future that she ended up having, a life that she's living now, which ties in very much to meaning and empowerment. Those experiences, those negative experiences that she had, being mistreated and being in distress, she's now using that to educate people and to change the experience for other people, which brings about empowerment for herself, as well as accepting the voices and respecting the role that they were playing in her life. That was empowerment for her, which in turn impacts somebody's identity. She went from being seen as unwell and insane and a patient to being an educator and changing the world in some ways. Maybe it's too much to say, but I think in some ways that's what she's doing. And that gives hope. It gives hope to me, but I think it sounded like she was very hopeful in the end of that clip. And she knows that she's making a difference in other people's lives. And I think that using that experience in part of a role is a really rewarding experience for Eleanor. So you can already see a couple of ways that CHIME might play out in people's lives. But now I want to start thinking about how it could play out in your life. So I want you to either use the attachment that you will find along with this video, or get a piece of paper and split it up into 5 different sections like this. So you might just draw a few boxes or do some headings. So the first heading I want you to put is connectedness. Then write down hope and optimism. Then identity, meaning, and empowerment. Write down those 5 headings, and then I'll give you the next instruction. Once you've written down those 5 headings, I want you to take some time and answer the following questions and write down your answers underneath those headings. So the first one, which factors of the CHIME model do you already have in place? And what does that look like? And then I want you to ask yourself, which factors of the CHIME model have you not established yet? And what would you like to work on? So for example, some people might say that they feel really connected. Maybe they're a part of a certain community, and that's they're receiving peer support. They've got connectedness. Maybe they do have a sense of meaning in what they're doing, and they feel empowered in making decisions in their life, but they're not really feeling a great sense of hope and optimism, or perhaps they're not feeling their identity isn't feeling strong. So they might write down where they're finding that hope, where they're finding connectedness, meaning, and empowerment, what that looks like, how it plays out in their life. And then would come back to hope and identity and write down how they would like to work on those and where maybe they could find it. I would encourage you, as you do this activity, to talk to somebody else, either while you're doing it or after you do it. Get ideas from them. Ask them where they find their connectedness, their hope, their identity, their meaning, and their empowerment. Ask them what it means for them. So take a bit of time now, answer the following questions, and after you've made some points, maybe after 20 minutes or so, I want you to restart the video, replay the video. So pause it, work on the questions, and then play the video. Now that you have completed the CHIME activity and you've written into each of the sections, I want you to think about what you've gained from this session and from doing that activity. And I want you to write down what you're going to do differently after today. And once you've done that, you're finished with the CHIME webinar. Thank you so much for joining me on this information session to understand a little bit more about the CHIME model, and I hope you got something from it. If you're interested in asking any further questions or finding out more information or going through that process in a group setting, please feel free to reach out to me and you can ask those questions. The best contact is info@mifwa.org.au. Thanks so much for listening and take care.